The maid's toddler pretended to be blind, to test if the billionaire really loved her. The Whitmore estate sat at the end of a long, oak-lined driveway in Greenwich, Connecticut, the kind of driveway that made ordinary people feel small before they even reached the front door. 12,000 square feet of marble floors, cathedral ceilings, and art that cost more than most people's lifetimes. Peter Whitmore had built this house, or rather, he had paid people to build it, and he lived in it the way most men live in hotels, passing through, barely noticing the details, never fully arriving. At 36, Peter was the kind of man magazines called formidable. He had steel-gray eyes that could silence a boardroom and a jaw that photographers loved. He had made his fortune in green energy infrastructure, turning wind and sun into billions before he was 30.
Forbes wrote about him.
Harvard business students studied him. Women fell in love with him at galas, and he smiled politely and forgot their names by morning. He did not mean to be cold. He simply had never learned how to be warm. His mother had died when he was 9. His father had handed him off to boarding schools and nannies, patting his shoulder at Christmas and calling it love. Peter had grown up understanding that love was something you demonstrated through provision, tuition payments, trust funds, expensive gifts. The language of the heart was a dialect he had never been taught. So he built walls. Beautiful, expensive walls. And he lived behind them, alone, in his 12,000 square foot house. Nora Callahan arrived on a Tuesday in March, 2 weeks after his previous housekeeper had retired. She was 28 years old, with dark chestnut hair pulled back in a practical bun, quiet brown eyes that missed nothing, and hands that were always moving, wiping, straightening, folding, carrying. She came with impeccable references and one condition that his estate manager had almost not passed along. She needed to bring her 3-year-old daughter to work with her, just until she could arrange childcare. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Peter's estate manager, Gerald, had relayed this with visible anxiety. Peter had barely looked up from his laptop. "Fine," he said. "Keep the child out of my study." And that was how Victoria entered the Whitmore estate. She arrived clinging to her mother's hand, wearing tiny red rain boots with white polkas, a yellow raincoat 2 sizes too large, and an expression of absolute, unblinking seriousness. She had her mother's dark eyes, but something else entirely in the way she used them, an ancient watchfulness, as if she had been assigned the task of observing the world and was taking that job very personally. On the drive over, Nora had prepped her daughter. "This is where Mama works now, Vicky. It's a big house. You need to be quiet and good and stay close to me." Victoria had listened, then asked, "Does the man who lives there have a dog?" "No, baby." "Does he have any kids?"
"No."
"Is he sad?" Nora had paused. "I don't know him yet, sweetheart." Victoria nodded slowly, as if filing that information away for later investigation. The first 3 days, Victoria stayed close to Nora, coloring quietly, padding behind her mother like a tiny, solemn shadow. Peter barely noticed her. He left early, came home late, ate alone at the long dining table, and retreated to his study. But on the 4th morning, everything changed. Nora was upstairs changing linens when she heard something shatter below. Her heart lurched.
She ran.
She found the kitchen in minor catastrophe, a juice glass in pieces, orange juice spreading across the marble, and Victoria standing in the middle of it all, utterly still, eyes squeezed shut, arms rigid at her sides. And Peter Whitmore crouching down beside her. He had come in early, rare, and had walked into the kitchen to find a small child trying to pour herself juice from a pitcher far too heavy for her tiny arms. He had watched, frozen, as the glass tipped and shattered. He had watched Victoria go completely still. "Hey," he said, voice rougher than he intended. "Did the glass cut you?" Victoria didn't answer, didn't open her eyes. He reached out and gently touched her arm. "You're okay. Can you open your eyes?" Still nothing. Nora came rushing in, breathless with apologies. Peter said quickly, "She's not hurt. She won't open her eyes. Then Victoria spoke, in a very small, very serious voice. I can't see. A long silence fell over the kitchen. I can't see, she repeated. It happened when the glass broke. Everything went dark. Nora's mouth opened. She knew her daughter. She knew this face, the deliberate stillness, the slightly formal speech. Victoria was not blind. Victoria was performing. But she didn't yet understand why. Peter Whitmore, who had never spent more than 30 seconds in this child's presence, looked at that small pale face with its tightly shut eyes and felt something slam into his chest like a fist. Okay, he said quietly. Don't be scared. And before anyone fully knew what was happening, Peter slid one arm under Victoria's knees and one behind her back and lifted her carefully away from the broken glass. She was so light. He hadn't expected her to be so light. She kept her eyes closed. Her body went still in his arms. And then, almost imperceptibly, she leaned her small dark head against his chest. Peter stood in the middle of his kitchen, holding a 3-year-old he barely knew, surrounded by orange juice and broken glass, and something inside him, something old and calcified and carefully constructed over 27 years, cracked clean through. He did not know yet that it was the beginning of everything. He did not know yet that this child was watching him from behind those closed eyelids, silent and absolutely paying attention. He did not know yet that he was already being tested. In the days that followed, Victoria's blindness became a fixture of the Whitmore household. It came and went with a logic Nora could not crack. Alone with her mother, Victoria saw perfectly, navigated hallways confidently, colored with precision, stacked building blocks with architectural ambition. But the moment Peter's footsteps sounded in the hall, Victoria's eyes would slide shut, and she would become a child navigating the world without sight. She did it with remarkable commitment. She extended her small hand, fingers spread, feeling the air. She tilted her head, as if using sound to map the space. She took slow, careful steps. She never peeked, never broke character. And the consistency of it was extraordinary for a child who hadn't yet mastered telling time. One evening, while braiding Victoria's hair, Nora tried carefully. Vicky, baby, can we talk about your eyes? They're fine when you're here, Victoria said simply. But when Mr. Whitmore? I want to see what he does, Victoria said, with calm matter-of-factness that made Nora's comb stop mid-stroke. When he thinks I can't see him. Nora set the comb down. She came around to look at her daughter's face. Victoria Grace Callahan, what are you doing? Victoria considered this. Checking, she said finally. Checking what? If he's good. She looked at her mother with those ancient eyes. You always say that people show who they really are when they think nobody's watching. So I made it so. He thinks nobody's watching. Nora sat back on her heels, throat tight. Her 3-year-old daughter had engineered a behavioral experiment on a billionaire in his own house. Meanwhile, Peter was failing to behave the way billionaires were supposed to behave. The morning after the kitchen incident, he came downstairs to find Victoria seated at the kitchen island, eyes closed, hands folded in her lap, waiting. Gerald had made her oatmeal. She hadn't touched it. Why aren't you eating? Peter asked, setting down his coffee. I can't find the spoon, Victoria said gravely. He looked. The spoon was 6 inches from her right hand. He looked at her closed eyes. He looked at the spoon. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of understanding, or the beginning of it, but he said nothing. He simply picked up the spoon, pressed it gently into her hand, and folded her small fingers around it. There, he said quietly. Thank you, Victoria said, with enormous dignity. And she began to eat. He sat across from her. He opened his laptop. He did not leave. Nora, watching from the doorway, felt something she could not name press against her ribs. Over the following days, Peter began quietly rearranging the world around a child he believed could not see it. He moved the low glass vases from the hallway tables after Victoria walked into one, carefully, experimentally, at exactly the right speed to be convincing. He had thick, soft rugs brought up from storage and placed in the common areas. He started announcing himself before entering rooms. A knock, a cleared throat, a deliberate footfall. He drove himself to a specialty store on a Saturday morning. Gerald later mentioned this to Nora with a kind of reverent disbelief, and came home with a collection of children's audiobooks and a small, high-quality speaker that he set up in the sitting room at exactly the height of a 3-year-old's ear. He never mentioned any of it. He made no announcements. He asked for no gratitude. He simply, quietly, made the world softer for a small girl he believed was living in darkness. Victoria noticed everything. She told her mother each night, in whispered installments, like a field agent reporting back from deep cover. He moved the flowers, she would say. He put a rug by the stairs. He knocked on the door today before he came in. Mama, he got me books. He got me stories. And he didn't even tell me. He just put them there. Nora listened to all of it with a heart that was becoming increasingly complicated. She had come here to work, to earn a steady paycheck in a stable environment while she rebuilt her life, quietly, carefully, one day at a time. She had not come here to feel things about her employer. She had definitely not come here to watch her employer fall silently, almost helplessly, in love with her daughter. But she was watching it happen. One rug, one audiobook, one quietly announced entrance at a time. And she was beginning to understand something that frightened her more than poverty ever had. This man, this cold, famous, walled-off man, was kinder than he knew. He had just never been given the right person to be kind to, until a 3-year-old in red polka-dot boots had closed her eyes and decided to find out what lived behind his walls. 3 weeks had passed since Victoria's blindness had begun, and Peter Whitmore had not slept well in all of them. It wasn't anxiety, exactly. It was more like a low, persistent hum in his chest, the sound, he was slowly realizing, of a heart that had been idle for a very long time suddenly finding a reason to turn back on. He was not accustomed to this feeling. He was accustomed to solving problems with money, with strategy, with the efficient application of resources. But no resource in his considerable arsenal could solve the particular problem of a 3-year-old girl who sat in the sunlit morning kitchen with her eyes closed, eating oatmeal with careful dignity, and made him feel like the most important person in the world simply by existing in the same room as him. He had started working from home more often. He told Gerald it was because of the infrastructure project, conference calls, time zone complications, the usual. Gerald, who had worked for the Whitmore family for 30 years and recognized a changed man when he saw one, said nothing and simply ensured that fresh coffee appeared in the kitchen at 8 o'clock when Victoria had her breakfast. It had become a ritual, small and unannounced. Peter would come down with his laptop. Victoria would already be at the island, eyes closed, hands folded. He would set his coffee down. He would say, "Good morning." She would say, "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore," in her very serious little voice. And then they would exist together in the quiet kitchen while the Connecticut morning came in through the tall windows. He began talking to her. He wasn't sure when it started. It crept up on him the way important things often do, disguised as something small and harmless. One morning, he found himself describing what was outside the window. The oak trees. A cardinal that had appeared on the garden fence. The way the light looked on the frost-covered grass. "The cardinal is very red," he told her. "Like your boots." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "Does he look happy?" she asked. Peter looked at the bird. "He looks confident," he said finally. "Like he owns the fence." Victoria smiled. Not a polite smile, not a performance, but a real one, quick and bright, gone almost before it arrived. Peter felt it land somewhere in the center of his chest and stay there. He started leaving small things for her. Not gifts, nothing so formal. Just objects he thought she might find interesting, placed where she would encounter them. A smooth piece of pale green sea glass on the kitchen island, a small wooden puzzle box on the sitting room coffee table, a pine cone of unusual size on the windowsill. He left them without comment. He watched from a careful distance as she found them, eyes still closed, fingers moving over their surfaces with real attention, reading them like Braille. "What is this?" she asked one morning, turning the sea glass over in her hands. "Sea glass," he said. "From a beach in Maine. It's glass that the ocean has worn smooth." "The ocean made it soft," she said. "The ocean made it beautiful," he said. "Tumbled it against sand and rock until all the sharp edges were gone." Victoria held the sea glass very still in her small palm. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "Getting tumbled?" The question hit him somewhere undefended. He was quiet for a moment. "I think," he said carefully, "it probably did. For a while. But then it didn't anymore." She nodded, as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. Nora watched all of this from the periphery of her own days, moving through the house with her cart of cleaning supplies and her careful, professional distance, and felt the walls of that distance thinning in ways she could not afford and could not seem to stop. She had built her own walls. She had been building them for 4 years, since Victoria's father had walked out of their apartment in Portland with a duffel bag and a speech about not being ready, leaving behind a woman 7 months pregnant and a silence so complete it had its own weight. She had built her walls out of necessity and pride and the particular fierce love of a woman who decides that if the world will not be kind to her, she will make herself not need its kindness. But kindness, it turned out, was very hard to ignore when it came wrapped in sea glass and quietly moved vases and a man who had started announcing himself before entering rooms. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself he was simply a decent person responding to an unusual circumstance. She told herself that men like Peter Whitmore did not fall in love with their housekeepers, and that the flutter in her chest when he said good morning in that low, careful voice was nothing more than the reasonable response of a lonely woman to prolonged proximity with an attractive man. She almost believed herself. Then came the afternoon when she heard him reading. She had been heading down the upstairs hallway toward the linen closet when she heard his voice floating up from the sitting room below, low, steady, unhurried.
She stopped.
She stood perfectly still in the hallway and listened. He was reading aloud. He was reading from one of the audiobook collections he had purchased, but he wasn't playing the recording. He was reading it himself, in his own voice, to Victoria, who was curled on the sitting room sofa with her eyes closed, a small blanket pulled over her knees. He was reading Charlotte's Web. He was reading the part where Charlotte first speaks to Wilbur in the darkness. "I've watched you all day, and I like you." And Victoria, eyes closed, face soft, was smiling the way children smile when they feel completely safe, from the inside out, without guarding anything. Nora pressed her hand against the wall to steady herself. She did not go downstairs for a very long time. The 4th week arrived, and with it, something neither Peter nor Nora had anticipated. The situation became known. It started with Peter's younger sister, Diana, who came for an unannounced weekend visit and walked into the kitchen to find her famously cold, famously unavailable brother guiding a 3-year-old's hands over the surface of a globe, describing the continents by feel. Diana stood in the kitchen doorway for a full 30 seconds before either of them noticed her. "Peter," she said finally. Her voice was strange, careful, as if she were approaching something wild that might startle. He looked up. "Diana, I didn't know you were coming."
"Obviously," she said.
She looked at Victoria. Victoria had gone still, eyes closed, head tilted slightly, listening. "Who is this?" "This is Victoria," Peter said. "She lives here. For now. She lives here. With her mother, who works here." Diana looked at her brother. This man who had not had a pet, a plant, or any living thing in his home for 15 years because, he had once explained, he didn't want the responsibility, and then looked at the small, serious child who had her hands on his globe. "Hello, Victoria," Diana said. "Hello," said Victoria. You sound like Mr. Whitmore, but softer. Diana blinked. I'm his sister. He has a sister? Victoria considered this. He didn't tell me. He doesn't tell anyone anything, Diana said, looking at her brother with an expression that was trying not to become a smile. It's his most annoying quality. Diana, Peter said, with warning in his voice. Can you describe yourself? Victoria asked Diana. Since I can't, she paused, with perfect theatrical timing, see you? Diana crouched down to Victoria's level. I have dark hair like my brother. Brown eyes. I'm wearing a blue coat. I have a scar on my chin from falling off a horse when I was 7. Victoria reached out. After a brief, surprised pause, Diana leaned forward, and Victoria's small fingers found her chin, traced the thin line of the scar with complete seriousness. Does it still hurt? Victoria asked. Not anymore, Diana said. Good, said Victoria, and returned her hands to the globe. Diana stood up. She looked at her brother with an expression he recognized, the one she had worn at their mother's funeral when she was 6 and he was 9, and she had reached up and taken his hand without being asked. She mouthed across the kitchen. She's not blind. Peter went very still. Diana tilted her head. You know? Something crossed his face then, something complicated and layered, and Diana, who had spent 30 years loving her opaque, difficult, tender underneath brother, read it in an instant. He had known for at least a week, maybe longer. He had figured it out and said nothing. He had continued making accommodations, reading aloud, describing cardinals and sea glass and the texture of continents, not because he believed the child couldn't see, but because he understood, in whatever deep and wordless way he understood things, that she needed him to. Diana pressed her fingers briefly to her mouth. Then she composed herself. I'll go find Nora, she said lightly. Say hello. She found Nora in the laundry room, and she said, without preamble, My brother is in love with your daughter. Nora set down the sheets she was folding. Excuse me? Possibly also with you, Diana continued, sitting on top of the dryer with the ease of a woman who sat on appliances in strangers' laundry rooms regularly. But definitely with Victoria. He's reading her Charlotte's Web. He reorganized his entire home office schedule to be downstairs in the mornings. He drove 40 minutes to buy sea glass. My brother, who once had his assistant pick out a birthday card for me because he didn't have time, drove 40 minutes to find a piece of beach glass for a 3-year-old. Nora was quiet for a long moment. She's performing, she said finally. The blindness. She's not. I know, Diana said. And I think Peter knows too. The words landed in the laundry room like stones dropped into still water. Then why? Nora began. Because, Diana said simply, she needed him to be the kind of man who would. And he needed to find out if he still was. That night, Nora sat on the edge of Victoria's small bed after lights out and looked at her daughter's face in the dim glow of the nightlight, that small, serious face going soft and open in sleep, and understood for the first time the full weight of what her child had done. Victoria had not been testing Peter for herself alone. She had been testing him for both of them, for all 3 of them. She had looked at this closed, famous, lonely man and decided, with the absolute clear-eyed certainty of a child who has not yet learned to stop believing in goodness, that there was something worth finding inside him, and she had gone in after it. At 3 years old, with polka-dot boots and closed eyes, she had done what no one in Peter Whitmore's life had managed to do in 36 years. She had made him show up. It happened on a Sunday. The sun was winter-pale and generous over the Whitmore estate, and the house had the particular golden hush of a morning with nothing required of it. Nora had the day mostly off. Gerald had come in to oversee a delivery, and she had let herself exhale in a way she rarely allowed, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea going warm in her hands. Victoria had disappeared somewhere in the house, as she sometimes did on quiet mornings, moving through the large rooms with the proprietary ease of a child who has decided a space belongs to her. Peter found her in the library. It was the room he loved most and used least, floor-to-ceiling shelves, an enormous stone fireplace, 2 armchairs, and an ottoman that he had chosen himself and then almost never sat in. He had come in to retrieve a folder he'd left on the desk and found Victoria standing in the middle of the Persian rug, eyes wide open, turning slowly in a circle. She had not heard him come in. For a moment, just one, they were simply 2 people looking at each other across a room. Her eyes were wide open and full of light. His face was entirely still. Then Victoria realized. Her eyes snapped shut. But it was too late, and she knew it, and she knew that he knew, and the room went very, very quiet. Peter set his folder down on the desk. He crossed the room slowly and settled into one of the armchairs. He clasped his hands in front of him. "Victoria," he said. She stood perfectly still in the center of the rug, eyes closed, chin slightly lifted.
She did not speak.
"You can open your eyes," he said. His voice was very gentle. "It's okay." A long pause. Then, slowly, her eyelids lifted. She looked at him with a direct, unflinching gaze. Those dark eyes full of something that was not quite guilt and not quite defiance, but something in between. Something that looked, Peter thought, remarkably like courage. "How long have you known?" she asked. Her voice was small but steady. "A while," he said. She absorbed this. "Are you mad?" He thought about it with the seriousness her question deserved.
"No," he said.
"I think I understand why you did it." "Why?" she asked, and it was a real question. The question of a 3-year-old who has done something intuitive and large and is only now beginning to reach for the words to explain it, even to herself. Peter leaned forward, elbows on his knees, bringing himself closer to her level. "Because," he said slowly, "you wanted to see what I was like when I thought no one could see me." Victoria looked at him steadily. And, he repeated, "What are you like?" The words were so simple and so enormous that Peter felt them in his throat. He sat with them for a moment. This man who had spent 36 years being watched and assessed and admired and maneuvered and never, not once, asked a question this honest. "I think," he said carefully, "I'm better than I thought I was. Because of you." Victoria was quiet. Then she crossed the rug, slowly, and stood in front of his chair. She put her small hands on his knees and looked up at him with those open, clear eyes. "I was scared you were mean inside," she said. "Some people look nice, and they're mean inside. My friend Tyler's dad is like that." "I know some people like that," Peter said. "But you're not," Victoria said. It wasn't a question. It was a verdict, delivered by a 3-year-old judge with polka-dot rain boots and the clearest eyes he had ever looked into. "You moved the flowers so I wouldn't walk into them. You got me books. You described the cardinal."
She paused.
"And you kept doing it, even after you knew." Peter's throat closed. "You kept doing it," she repeated, with the emphasis of someone delivering their most important evidence. "That's the part that matters," Mama says. Not just what people do when they might get caught. What they do when they're sure they won't." He could not speak for a moment. The fireplace crackled. The winter sun moved across the Persian rug. "Your mother," he managed finally, "is a very wise woman." "I know," said Victoria simply. "Then, do you like her?" He looked at this child, this extraordinary, solemn, ancient-eyed child who had come into his house in red polka-dot boots and dismantled 27 years of careful architecture without breaking a sweat. "Yes," he said, with an honesty that surprised even himself. "Very much." Victoria nodded, satisfied. "Good," she said. "Because she likes you too, but she won't say it because she thinks it's not allowed." "Not allowed. Because you're the boss and she works here." Victoria's expression communicated what she thought of this reasoning. "That's silly," she added helpfully. Peter let out a breath that was almost a laugh, low and rusty, like a door that hadn't been opened in years. "You're probably right," he said. Victoria studied him one more moment. Then, with the decision-making efficiency of a very small CEO, she reached up, put her arms around his neck, and hugged him. He froze for just a second. Then his arms came up and wrapped around her small warm back, and he held her. This child who had seen through every wall he'd ever built, and felt something in his chest complete itself, like a sentence that had been waiting years for its final word. "I wasn't really blind," she said into his shoulder. "I know," he said. "But I could see you," she said. "Even with my eyes closed. I could see you were good." He pressed his hand very gently against the back of her small dark head. "Thank you," he whispered, "for looking." 3 months later, the Whitmore estate looked the same from the outside. The long oak-lined driveway, the stone facade, the tall windows catching the April light. Everything as it had always been, imposing, elegant, perfectly maintained. But inside was different in ways that no architect could have drawn and no interior designer could have achieved. There were red polka-dot boots by the front door. There was a drawing, bright, ambitious, technically chaotic, taped to the refrigerator in the kitchen, depicting what appeared to be 3 people of dramatically varying sizes holding hands in front of a very large house. It was labeled, in careful letters that curved upward with enthusiasm, Peter, Nora, Vicky home. There was a corner of the sitting room that had been claimed, quietly, incrementally, irrevocably, by a small person who arranged her stuffed animals there in a formation that suggested military precision, and her books there in a stack that suggested an organizational system only she fully understood. There was, on the kitchen island at 8 o'clock every morning, a coffee for Peter, a tea for Nora, and a small cup of warm milk with honey for Victoria. Gerald made it without being asked. He had been making it for 2 months. The morning it changed, the morning everything became official, became spoken, became real, was a Thursday in April when the cherry trees along the back garden fence bloomed overnight, turning the yard into something embarrassingly, inconveniently beautiful. Peter had come down to find Nora already at the window, looking out at the trees with a cup of tea going cool in her hands, and Victoria on the kitchen floor building an elaborate block city with the focused intensity of a civic planner. The morning light was coming in long and golden, and Nora's hair was loose around her shoulders, and she turned when she heard his footsteps and smiled. A real smile, the unguarded kind she had been letting slip with increasing frequency and always quickly controlled, and for once she didn't control it. She let it stay. And Peter looked at her, looked at this woman who had come to his house with a cleaning cart and a toddler and had, somehow, in the space of 12 weeks, made his house into a home without his fully realizing it was happening, and said, without planning to, without any of the strategic calculation he brought to every other significant decision in his life, "I don't want you to leave." The kitchen went quiet except for the soft click of Victoria's blocks. Nora looked at him steadily. "My contract." "I'm not talking about the contract," he said. "I'm talking about—" He stopped. He was not good at this. He had never been good at this. But he had been practicing, these past months, in small ways, describing cardinals, reading Charlotte's Web, saying what he meant to a 3-year-old who had required him to. "I'm talking about all of this," he said. "The mornings. The kitchen. You." He paused. "Victoria." Nora's hands tightened on her mug. "I know what this looks like from the outside," he said. "I know the obvious objections. I know it's fast and it's complicated, and I know that a man like me asking this of a woman in your position could be," he searched for the word, "loaded. I know that. I'm not asking you to dismiss any of it." "Then what are you asking?" she said, very quietly. "I'm asking if you want this," he said. "Not because you work here. Not because I'm offering you security or comfort or any of the things I could offer you that would be transactional. But because—" He stopped again. He looked at her with those gray eyes that had learned, over 12 weeks, to stay open. "Because I'm better when you're here. I'm better when she's here." He gestured, a small, almost helpless gesture, toward Victoria on the floor. "I'm better in ways I can't fully explain and wasn't expecting, and I don't want to stop being better." Silence. Then Victoria looked up from her block city. She had been listening, of course. She had always been listening. "Mama," she said, with the calm authority of a very small CEO who has been waiting for this meeting to reach its conclusion, "just say yes." Nora let out a sound that was half laugh, half something else entirely. She pressed her free hand against her eyes for a moment. "You," she said to her daughter, "are 3 years old." "Almost 4," Victoria corrected, and returned to her blocks. Nora lowered her hand. She looked at Peter, really looked at him the way she had been carefully not looking for 3 months, and saw what she had always been trying not to see. A man who had been tumbled by the ocean, as he'd once described the sea glass, until all his sharp edges were worn smooth. A man who had rearranged his entire world around a small person with closed eyes. A man who knocked before entering rooms now, not just for Victoria, but for everyone, as if the lesson of consideration had seeped from the one specific context into his whole character, spreading quietly, the way light spreads. A good man who had needed the right people to make him certain of it. "Okay," she said. It was a small word for something so large. But Peter understood it entirely. He crossed the kitchen and took her free hand in both of his, carefully, as if it were sea glass, as if it were something the ocean had made beautiful, and he intended to be worthy of holding. Victoria made a small, satisfied sound and added another block to her city. It was Gerald who, that evening, presenting dinner with the quiet ceremony he brought to all things, set the table with 4 places. As he had, quietly, for the past 3 weeks, ever since he had decided, with the authority of 60 years and 30 of them in service to the Whitmore family, that the situation had clearly resolved itself, and it was simply a matter of waiting for the principals to catch up. "Gerald," Peter said, looking at the table. "Yes, sir," Gerald said, not looking up. "You set 4 places. The round table does seat 4, sir. Seems a shame to waste the space." Peter looked at Nora. Nora looked at Victoria, who had climbed into her chair and was arranging her fork with the focused attention of someone who takes cutlery seriously. "Fine," Peter said and sat down. And that was that. Later, weeks later, months later, long into a future that had once seemed, to all 3 of them, unlikely, Victoria would be asked, by a journalist writing a profile of Peter Whitmore that touched on his family, how her parents had met. She would answer with the complete confidence of a child who has always known exactly what she was doing. "I closed my eyes," she would say, "so I could see him better." The journalist would not fully understand this. But the 2 adults in the room would look at each other over their daughter's head. This daughter who had arrived with polka-dot boots and ancient eyes and a courage that put the rest of them to shame, and they would understand it perfectly. Some people show you who they are when they think no one is watching. Peter Whitmore had shown them everything. And a 3-year-old girl in red polka-dot boots had been watching all along.